It has been a couple of months since my last devlog. In the middle of May, not long after that devlog, I ended up taking a couple of weeks off. My wife and I went on a vacation to the Grand Canyon. It was a very cool trip. I got to take a helicopter tour that landed down near the Colorado River. It's something that I've been wanting to do for years. It was just such an awesome experience. My wife and I had a great time, and I got to draw on the plane, and I'm pretty proud of the results. And I got back, and I was ready and rearing to go on some programming. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to get the complete logistics system working for the game. And that could be broken down into two big steps. Get the claw arms moving items onto and off of the belts and setting up machines. But in programming, as in life, things are never that simple. When I was working on the conveyor belt system, I set it up so that I could just click on a conveyor belt and it would magically create an item out of thin air, and that would allow me to test the conveyor belt system. But if I wanted to flesh out the entire logistics system, I needed something more concrete than that. I needed an actual game mechanic that would create those crates for me. And so my idea was that I would use tiles with inventory and that the claw arms would be able to pull the crates out of that inventory. And the best candidate for that was the barn. My idea here was that any animals in the same pasture as a barn would automatically send their drops to that barn. And in order to do that, I needed to actually be able to tell which animals and barns were in the same pasture as each other. And I had a few ideas on how I could do that, but that exposed another problem. I needed to be able to track the pastures even if you added or removed tiles from them. And somehow I still didn't have any way of actually removing tiles. So if I wanted to be able to test the ability to remove tiles from a pasture, I needed some sort of bulldoze tool. And in order to do that, I knew I was going to have to do some code rewrites. So I started there. I had this class called Builder Tool. It's what most of these buttons here use in order to actually place the tile in the game world, and that class was doing just a little bit too much. It had a bunch of input handling code baked into it, and I needed to be able to reuse that code for the bulldozer tool. It also handled the drawing of the selection box, which is another thing that I needed to be able to reuse for the bulldozer tool, but it was also limiting what I could do with the selection box, and I had it on my to-do list to remove that from the Builder tool for quite some time. Refactoring code is an important step in the programming process. I am constantly going back through my old code and finding ways to optimize and improve it. And try as you might, you just can't plan for everything. And sometimes you're just going to write crappy code, and that's fine. It's part of the process. Just go back and fix it whenever you can. So a few days later, I got all the changes to compile. There were some minor bugs, but after I resolved those, everything was working really well. And thanks to the new code change, I was finally able to have two different selection boxes on a single tool. So I could have one selection box for the single select, like these carrot seeds here, and a separate selection box for the area select. This was a nice feature that I'd wanted for a while, but the main benefit of the code rewrite was that it made the bulldozer tool relatively trivial. Being able to reuse the input handling and the selection box meant that I just needed to build the code to actually delete the tile, and boom, it just worked. It actually worked better than I expected. The rule tiles that I set up in the last devlog already had this function called update neighbors. Basically, anytime you added a new tile, it would inform all the neighbors around it that there had been a change, and that would give them a chance to redraw themselves. And so I didn't have to do anything extra when I deleted a tile. I just called that update neighbors function, and the rule tiles took care of themselves. Sometimes planning ahead actually does work out well for you, although I didn't properly test the deletion of the conveyor belts, and I probably should have. And that'll come back to bite me soon enough. But it's always nice to be able to cross two things off your list at once, and now it's time to work on pastures. Except in early June, I ended up taking another few days off. My nephew graduated from high school, and I decided to travel up to Michigan, where I'm from, and visit with my family. I actually made an oil painting for my mom. She's been very supportive of my art, and I wanted to give her something personal for Mother's Day. I used to draw a ton when I was a teenager, and for whatever reason, I ended up giving it up. But about a year and a half ago, I picked it up again, and I've been working at it pretty hard, and I'm starting to feel like I'm really getting quite a bit better at it. I drew this picture of a cat while I was chatting with my family, and I started this portrait of Anya Taylor-Joy from Last Night in Soho on a plane. This one took me about a week to finish, but I feel like it's one of my best yet. It's never too late to get back into something that you love. I'm not looking to become a professional artist or anything like that. I just really love doing it, and I find it relaxing. And honestly, keeping these skills honed is going to help me with my game, although I probably could stand to work on some game assets a little bit more. But I did have some really tough technical challenges to take on, and those took plenty of time on their own. And so when I got back from Michigan, the first thing on my mind was, how was I going to tell which objects are a part of which pasture? So the idea I had was to use a flood fill algorithm. It's basically like a paint bucket tool in an image editor. You start at one point and then you scan in all directions until you reach a border. And everything that you filled that way is going to become part of a pasture. So the simplest flood fill algorithm is a recursive one. You start at one point and then you scan all 4 of its neighbors, and then you call the same function for each of its neighbors, and then you call the same function for each of its neighbors, and on and on and on until you reach the borders. That's a fairly easy function to understand, but it's not the most efficient. And most importantly, each tile gets checked 4 times. And if you know anything about Unity, I have to call the function getComponent every time I check a tile. Now, that isn't the slowest function in the world, but it's definitely not the fastest either. And calling it 4 times for every tile is going to add up real quick. So there's a more efficient algorithm that uses scan lines. It will check across an entire line, and then it will check up and down, and then it will call the same function for those 2 rows, and then continue on and on and on until it reaches all the borders. And this is several times faster than the recursive algorithm, and it also only checks each tile 3 times. But with optimization, it can be made to check only once, which is ideal. However, the algorithm is quite a bit harder to understand. I actually ended up using a Google Sheet to help me visualize it, and that helped me out quite a bit. And I found some sample code online, and so I got cracking on an implementation. So I finished up the algorithm, and I immediately ran into this issue where multiple tiles were being updated and their flood fills were actually fighting against each other. And I love this moment. I was actually recording for this devlog, explaining the issue, and then this happened. Hard to describe. So we'll start, it always starts in the upper left-hand corner, right? And so it's going to start here, it's going to flood fill, it's going to change all these to the same pasture. And then it's going to come to this one. And actually, because this one's already updated this frame, we can just skip it. We can just skip it, right? We can skip all of them. And yeah, that solution actually worked and was a lot faster. There's this funny idea in programming. It's called rubber duck debugging. It's where you explain your problems to a rubber duck. And sometimes just the act of saying your problem out loud, even to an inanimate object, can help you realize something that you missed. This happens to me all the time at work. I'll type out an email asking somebody for help, and in the process of explaining the problem in the email, the solution will just come to me, and the email will never get sent. And I think this is true of most problem-solving tasks. If you can't figure it out, try talking it out, even if it's just to a rubber duck or to a camera. So after that, I had a few small bugs that mostly had to do with one-wide tiles that weren't being included in the flood fill, and I had to do some pretty intense debugging here, and I cracked my Google Sheet back out, and I was tracing line by line, trying to figure out what was missing, and it ended up being some small differences in the way I was handling things. The sample code was using integers, and I was using a data structure that referenced a tile, and there was some subtle differences, like the order of operations on this minus minus here that was really easy to miss because my code was structured a little bit differently, but it created these small bugs that actually were quite noticeable. But I managed to get them fixed, and the flood fill was working quite well, even for really weird pastures like this one. Glossing over a few small details, once I got the flood fill working, I didn't have much trouble at all getting the animal drops to pop up in the barn. And so now it was time to work on the claw arms. I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to handle the claw arms, but I tend to have a just get started mindset when it comes to programming. I don't like to overplan because a lot of the times you won't even realize the full scope of the problem until you get in and start working on it. And in this case, I hadn't realized that there's some weirdness with belt priorities and claw arms. Like a claw arm pulling an item off a belt should have the highest priority, but a claw arm putting an item on onto a belt should have the lowest priority. So it seemed like the claw arms actually needed 2 tick events. What I ended up doing instead was having a tick event for the claw arm that happened before the conveyor tick. So that had the highest priority and would only remove items from the belt. And then I actually had the claw arm become a part of the conveyor chain, but only in one direction, the direction that put items onto the belt. So then the conveyor chain would actually request items from the claw arm, but only when it had proper priority. So that ended up working, but was a little bumpy at first. I had reintroduced a stutter to the belt that was easy enough to fix, but then I started running into several infinite loop bugs that would freeze up my Unity engine. Because I hadn't fully tested the interactions between the conveyor belt and the bulldoze tool, I thought that these bugs had something to do with the claw arm, and it did not. I found and fixed 2 different infinite loop bugs, one that had to do with the bulldoze tool, and another one that had to do with dragging the conveyor belt tool. So that one had actually been around for a while, but was easy enough to fix. The other one was pretty hard to find. It ended up, I actually wasn't properly deleting all the references to the deleted tiles, and they were just sticking around in memory and causing problems. I accidentally stumbled onto another bug from the bulldozer tool that was causing there to be 2 chain owners on a single conveyor chain, and I was able to fix that, but then that fix ended up causing another infinite loop. So yeah, I had a ton of fun dealing with infinite conveyor belt loops, and it was really frustrating because every time it happened, I'd have to restart Unity. And then I eventually got wise and added some additional checks that should prevent infinite loops from happening. So if there are more bugs like this, and there probably are, then what they should do is cause a stutter or part of the belt to stop, but they shouldn't, hopefully, cause the entire game to crash. So that was one major task checked off my list, and the hardest one by far. Compared to what I'd already done, setting up the machines was going to be a breeze, but I wasn't quite ready to take it so easy on myself. I wanted there to be a way to load recipe data from JSON files. I wasn't sure what options Unity had for making a game moddable, but it seemed like loading data from JSON files was a reasonable way to make code-free modding possible in my game. But it turns out that Unity has no support whatsoever for making a game moddable. You have to either build it yourself, or there are a few third-party options available. But I was able to figure out how to load user JSON data into the recipes. And for now, at least, it looks like that's the only modding that's going to be available in the game. So I will probably implement the same thing for items and crops and animals some point in the near future. So that out of the way, I was on to the last step, which is setting up the machines themselves. It did take a bit of an inventory rewrite to get everything working with recipes, but nothing too challenging. And before long, I had a machine that would actually accept items that were relevant to its recipe. And by the way, these are placeholder machines and placeholder recipes. I just wanted to get the basic mechanics working, and then I will probably flesh it out a bit more in the next devlog. And with just a little bit more coding, I had myself a machine processing loop. And since I had already set up the claw arms to remove items from objects with inventory, it had no trouble removing the output from the machine and placing it on the belt. It just worked. So that's the whole logistics loop right there. It is a bit bare bones and there's not a way to sell anything yet, but all the base mechanics are all functioning. And in my next devlog, I'd like to explore the idea of the game economy, and that will likely lead to me fleshing out these ideas a bit more. Oh, I almost forgot to mention that I actually created a logo for the game. You've probably already seen it. I'm sure I'll put it in the thumbnail somewhere. But I was watching a video on logo designs, and they mentioned a site that would actually randomly generate logos for you. I actually can't find the site anymore. I'll try to find it before I post this video. But none of the ideas were really what I wanted, but I was able to mash together a few of them, and then I added the claw arm. Obviously, none of their designs had claw arms in them. But what came together, I think, is a pretty good looking logo. The name, by the way, Factory Farmer, isn't set in stone, but it is growing on me, and it's become, at the very least, the working name for this game. I did spend some time, by the way, trying to get the claw arm to animate properly. There's a funny bug here that was caused by me failing to deparent the crate from the rig. And that was an easy enough fix, but even with it fixed, it's still behaving kind of weirdly. But honestly, how the claw arm looks and animates just isn't that important yet. As excited as I am to see it working, I don't want to get too distracted by it. I was working on it a couple of days ago, but with the weekend coming up, I wanted to use the extra time to get this video out since it had been about 2 months. But I'm sure I'll spend more time on the claw arm in the very near future. I did want to end by showing off just one last piece of art. I did this oil painting from one of the pictures I took of the Joshua trees near the Grand Canyon. I normally have a pretty tough times with landscapes. They aren't really my forte, but I like to push my comfort zone a bit. I think it turned out well. I think the fact that it was personal to me, it was a photo I took of something that I experienced, helped out quite a bit. But thanks for watching. Bye now.